Shalom, this is Chris. We're following Jesus along the Talmudim way. Lesson 85, we're back. It's been a while, had some life events had to deal with, but now want to get back on track with our gospel study. Our Wednesday night teaching is currently in the middle of Matthew 24, so we will skip ahead from our last video, which was a while back, and we'll pick it up with a review of first part of Matthew 24, and then we'll slow it down and go verse by verse, starting at 29. Father, we ask you to bless our study and have us be like the Bereans who receive the word with all eagerness, but examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. By this teaching also enable us to be James 1:22, doers of your word and not hearers only. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So Matthew 24 begins with the disciples marveling at Herod's temple, and they had a reason to. So they say that the disciples came to him, showing him the buildings of the temple. While not officially one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the temple in Jerusalem was truly one of the crown jewels of the Roman Empire. The rabbis actually of the time wrote that if one had not seen the temple in Jerusalem, one could not have claimed to have seen anything beautiful in his life. The stone here just shows you how massive, the picture here shows you how massive the stones were. It's on the southern wall of the Temple Mount, on the southern approach between what's called the double and the triple gates. But there's several stones like this that are just absolutely huge, and it was truly magnificent. It wasn't gold, but the limestone or the sandstone there sparkled almost as if it was pearly white. And so it made a stark impression to anyone approaching Jerusalem in that day. Jesus replies, though, that, hey, you may think this building is really cool, but there will not be one stone left upon another that will not be thrown down. And until recently, you could actually touch fulfilled prophecy, and you see in the upper inset picture, that's what I'm doing there when I went in 2023. This is the picture of the stones that they believe were toppled by the Roman soldiers in 70 AD. Not necessarily of the temple, but of the temple retaining wall, but it gives us a sense of both of the scale of the largeness of the stones and for the destruction. I heard these stones have recently been roped off because some religious folk consider them holy. They're part of the temple, and they don't want tourists from Texas putting their hands all over them. So that's why I say until recently, I haven't been back there since, so we'll have to see next time. A lot of the stones weigh 2 to 4 tons, and some of them can weigh up to 570 tons. So these are just absolutely massive. He sat on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately. So this is verse 3 of chapter 24. So they head to the Mount of Olives, which is just across from the Temple Mount. This is all a very compact area. So in the foreground, you would have the old city of Jerusalem, and you could see the Temple Mount kind of set apart there. And then you have the Kidron Valley, and then on the other side, you have the Mount of Olives. And the Garden of Gethsemane is sort of in the center left of the screen there in the shadows. One speculation is that they had a meeting spot, and this may have been where this discourse took place. And it also happens to be where a few nights later, Jesus would go to the garden to pray. They end up asking Jesus 2 questions here, and Jesus replies with a long discourse that actually becomes the 5th and final of Matthew's extended teachings. We have a list here for you. So we started with Sermon on the Mount way back several years ago in our study from Matthew chapter 5 to 7. Then we had the missionary discourse, chapter 10. We had the kingdom parables, chapter 13, the community discourse in chapter 18, and we have what's called the eschatological discourse, or the Olivet discourse here in Matthew 24 and 25. Based on the location, it's been given the name Olivet discourse in a reference to the Mount of Olives. These 2 questions they ask are, when will these things be, and specifically meaning the destruction of the temple that Jesus just referenced with one stone not left upon another, and then what will the sign of the end of the age be? And so the end of the age that will usher in the next age. In Hebrew, the term for this age is Olam Hazeh, and the next age is Olam Haba, which is the Messianic kingdom. So they're really interested in the coming kingdom. One of our challenges with this study is when Jesus is giving these catastrophic depictions, we don't automatically know which question he's answering, and it can be quite dangerous to assume. Had this been in a courtroom, the opposing counsel would have objected because it is a compound question. You should only ask one question at a time, otherwise you don't know which question is under discussion here. Many scholars would think verse 28 concludes the discussion about Jerusalem in 70 AD, and then verse 29 kind of morphs into the end times discussion about the second coming. But not everyone agrees on that. Some people see some end times stuff intermingled even before verse 29. Passages like these, I've heard it compared to a mountain range that's off in the distance. So when you're driving, you can see mountain peaks kind of sort of one behind the other. From a distance, they look like they're right on top top of each other. But as you get closer and perhaps even cross the peak that's closest to you, you realize then that the second peak is actually several miles away, if not very much further than that. Here's an example from Scripture. Writing 700 years before Jesus, Isaiah says that Messiah will bring all these good things and also bring the day of vengeance. Easy, right? That's what it says, is it's all going to happen at once. But wait, when Jesus reads this quote, so we're at the synagogue in Nazareth, and note carefully what Jesus says and does not say. So he reads much the same thing, but when he gets to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord, and then he stops, and then he rolls up the scroll. So he does not read the day of vengeance of our God. And of course, that is intentional. His first coming, we now know, in hindsight, did not bring the day of the Lord and the day of wrath and the ushering in the Messianic kingdom. Vengeance and wrath is not why he came the first time. We now know that period is actually several thousand years, and there's going to come a day where the vengeance of God will take place, and that's what we have in view here. But the point is that what may seem to happen back to back can actually be quite distant. Why am I getting into all this? Well, because of the end times is so murky and there's so many different views, I would suggest that we hold any and all theories very loosely. And I say this as someone who at one point in my life was very much into Revelation and Daniel 9 and calculating the 173,880 days. And if you don't know what that is, you're probably better off for it. But I was into all that. And while I'm not saying don't study these books, because Revelation carries a specific blessing for those who read it, I'm now content to say that we know the general direction. We are already victorious because the enemy has been defeated. We have a glorious resurrection to look forward to. But I'm also content to say exactly how God is going to bring that about is not really my concern. And we'll see that that's what Jesus actually teaches his disciples. Your job is to be ready and not so much, kind of let me worry about the other details. So asking and understanding about the end is not by itself bad. We have minds. We've been given the ability to ask questions. But notice this passage in Acts 1 is one of my favorite passages when it comes to this stuff. So when they had come together, this is after the resurrection, but before the ascension, the disciples began asking him, Jesus, saying, Lord, is it at this time you are restoring the kingdom to Israel? Now, I've heard this taught that, those stupid Jews, they still don't get it. They're always wanting the kingdom to be restored. Notice what Jesus says. He does not rebuke them. He simply says, it is not for you to know the periods of the times or the appointed times by which the Father has set by his own authority. So he never rebukes the disciples for asking this question. It's a good and valid question. He's just saying it's not your job to worry about it. But note, what then is our job? What should we be worried about? That's in Acts 1:8. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses, both in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and as far as the remotest part of the earth. Our job is to spread the good news to those who are perishing and let Jesus kind of worry about the end time stuff. And so this is the passage I fall back on when you get into all these debates about pre-trib, post-trib, premillennial, post-millennial, amillennial. I don't know. I have my theories, but ultimately it's in God's hands, and my job is not to debate endlessly about that stuff. My job is to focus on being his witness. Watch that no one leads you astray. So he begins his answer by talking about deception, which is a theme the New Testament writers also pick up on. To me, it seems curious that by appearances, those who tend to fixate on the end times, and I'm talking about extremes on any given side, but especially those who are looking for signs of the end times by reading the daily newspaper, they seem to be more susceptible to deception. Ephesians talks about this, Paul writing, of course, until we attain the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to be a mature man or woman, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. As a result, we are no longer to be children tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by trickery of people, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. So the antidote to being deceived is maturity in the faith. If you want to spot a fake, you need to become intimately familiar with the real thing. After talking about the false teachers, he goes into these series of calamities here. There will be wars, rumors of wars, famines, and earthquakes in various places. Like Christianity, traditional Judaism also teaches that times of unusual trouble will precede the advent of the Messiah. And they use this phrase, the birth pains of the Messiah. Jesus talks about that. I don't have a slide for it, but it's based on multiple prophets who employed this birthing imagery. I'll give an example here, Jeremiah 4. I heard a voice cry as of a woman in labor, the anguish of one giving birth to her first child, the voice of the daughter of Zion gasping for breath, stretching out her hands. Ah, woe to me, for I faint before murderers. Things such as wars, earthquakes, persecutions, apostasy, which is believers who fall away, false messiahs, those are they're prevalent. They've kind of been common to our fallen human experience, but they're really non-signs. They're birth pangs before the baby is born. And so just kind of watch out for those, make note of them, but them by themselves doesn't mean the end is coming, no matter how bad things appear to be getting. Jesus is going to talk about the things to actually watch out for. Now, this verse is interesting, verse 14, and the gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world. We don't know what question this is answering. Is this answering the end of Jerusalem or the end of the age? We really don't know. Curiously, it could apply to both. If we're talking the Roman Empire, you could make a case that the gospel had gone out to all points of the known world at that time by AD 70. And conversely, you could argue that it still hasn't been fulfilled today. There are pockets of the world who have never heard of Jesus. Disciples live all around the world today. This is a church in Berea, which is the home reference of one of my favorite verses, Acts 17:11, that says the Bereans search the scriptures daily to see whether the things that they were taught were true. And I urge all of us to be Bereans. Don't believe a word I say just because I say it, but check it out, challenge, make sure you're understanding it and not just accepting it without checking. Then we get into, just going fast here through the first part of Matthew 24, then we get into the infamous abomination of desolation. If wars, disasters, and persecution do not signify either the fall of Jerusalem or the beginning of the Messianic era, they're preludes, then what does? Jesus says here, pay attention, let the reader understand. More than likely, this is only in reference to the end of Jerusalem because there has to be a temple and they have to be in Jerusalem, believers do. The next thing he says is basically get out of Jerusalem. So such an instruction would be unnecessary if he were talking about God's wrath. The most famous desecration after Daniel, but before Jesus and what Jesus was referencing here, was by the Seleucid king Antiochus IV in BC 167. He set up an idol to Zeus, sacrificed a pig on the altar, and he demanded to be worshipped as a deity. And if you know how Jews feel about pork and how they feel about idols, you can imagine how well this went over. And it led to what ultimately became the Maccabean Revolt, and it's a minor feast that we know today as Hanukkah. So that's the Hanukkah story. Jesus observes Hanukkah in John 10, which I find just absolutely fascinating because he didn't have to. It was a minor feast, but it says that he was there and made the trip to Jerusalem. This coin here shows a portrait of Antiochus IV, who set up the abomination that Daniel talked about, and gives us an example of what the abomination of desolation is. The reverse side of the coin shows the god Zeus, and so the things that were set up in the temple that just should not have been there. Jesus then says, "Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Well, Antiochus was way before Jesus, so did anything happen after Jesus? Well, yes. In AD 66, future Emperor Vespasian, he did evict all Jews from the temple compound, and he erected standards of the 10th Roman Legion. And you can see at the very top of one of those standards here. Note the upper right has a wild boar, which you can see. So again, we got this pork imagery, and we also have an eagle, which was a symbol of the legion. In the middle, you can see LEGX for Legion 10. The F is Fretensis, I believe that's how it's pronounced. So this marks the sign that when they saw this, believers watched for this, and they could get out before things got really bad. Verse 20 mentions to pray that the flight not be on a Sabbath, which means he's talking to a Jewish audience. As Gentiles, if we were facing a time of danger and had to flee our homes, I don't think we would care much what day it landed on, but Jews would, however. Eusebius, who's a Christian historian in the, I believe, 3rd or 4th century, reported that Jesus' warning to flee the mountains was fulfilled during the Jewish revolt. Jewish believers fled to Pella, and so they sort of missed out. They watched from the mezzanine when the Romans sacked and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. So this destruction of Jerusalem also gives way to the compelling story of the Jewish holdouts at a place called Masada out in the Judean desert. But we'll have to put a pin in that discussion until we can go there in person, but it's an absolutely fascinating story. So when you see the abomination standing in the holy place, most scholars, not all, but most believe that the Holy of Holies would have been located on the rock inside what is today the Dome of the Rock. This photograph here was taken between 1940 and 1946. Ever since 9/11, only Muslims have been allowed inside the Dome of the Rock as well as Al-Aqsa. But inside, we have some pictures from before that prohibition was put in place. There's literally a rock where we believe Abraham Abraham sacrificed Isaac, and where David set up an altar, and also where the temple stood. Daniel 9 and 2 Thessalonians 2 state that a coming world leader will act much like Antiochus did. He'll call himself put himself above all that is called God, is one of the quotes there. Even though Vespasian stood in the holy place, fulfilling Matthew 24, he actually didn't do this part. He wasn't nearly as heinous as Antiochus IV. So, we would think that Daniel 9 and 2 Thessalonians are still somewhat in the future. A person who has to come after Jesus and fulfills these other two references just hasn't happened yet. Any talk about a third temple today is to invite World War III, and so will be for the foreseeable future. But it would appear that at some point the temple will be rebuilt, and sadly, many Orthodox Jews are waiting for the temple as proof that Messiah has come. Now, unfortunately, these other passages tell us that the person who brings the temple may not be someone you want to follow. Jesus wraps up additional references to tribulation, such as not occurring since the beginning of the world. In verse 21, he talks about false Christs, and he's essentially saying, don't be deceived. He's not saying he will come back during this time, but he's just saying you'll know when it happens. The end of the age will be unmistakable, just as lightning is flashing in the sky. It won't be a secret thing that only a few people claim to have seen. One way of reading this section could be to say, as bad as things will get during the fall of Jerusalem, it actually doesn't mean the Son of Man has arrived, no matter what people claim. And then he concludes what many would see as the discussion on the destruction of the temple with wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. The same Greek word for vultures can mean eagles, and some make some to-do about that, and they see a connection to Rome. But in context here, context is king, the word should be translated as vultures. I got to visit Ross Perot's offices in Plano about 15 or 20 years ago, and he had one of his famous quotes is, eagles don't flock, you have to find them one at a time. So the fact that verse 28 here says the birds are flocking together tells us that they aren't eagles. It is, however, another example of birds being used negatively in the Bible, and these references are actually all over the place once you begin to notice them. The corpse reference here is probably multi-layered. Literally in 70 AD, the corpses did pile up in Jerusalem during the revolt, and that's as an affront to Jews who expect a prompt burial, otherwise the body is desecrated. So the burial needs to be the same day, so the fact that you had corpses would have just been highly offensive, and on top of everything else, insult to injury, as they say. Another layer, though, given the preceding verses about false messiahs, is to remind us that never waste a crisis didn't originate with the Clinton presidency. It's as old as time itself. Whenever things get bad, you will see these charlatans and grifters come up to start taking advantage of a tough situation for their own advancement and profit. You have the snake oil salesman, going from town to town claiming these things when times were tough. The two Jewish revolts, specifically back in these days, so there's one from 66 to 70, which is in view here, the 70 AD destruction. There was another one in the 130s. The more famous of that revolt leader was a guy by the name of, became known as Bar Kokhba. He was born Simon Bar Kokhba. Kokhba was probably a town, so Simon of this town, like we say Jesus of Nazareth. However, a prominent rabbi, Rabbi Akiva in that day, believed him to be the Messiah. He nicknamed him Simon Bar Kokhba, and that's the name that stuck. So he changed the TZ sound to a CH sound, and that name means son of the star, which is referring to the star prophecy in Numbers 24. After that fizzled out and people realized that this Simon was a false prophet, they later changed the one letter again to an S, Simon Bar Kokhba, which means son of a lie, because he was a false Messiah. As I said earlier, after verse 28, several commentators now see a pivot with verse 29 through all of chapter 25, talking about the future day of the Lord, the commencement of the Messianic kingdom. And so the descriptions that follow seem to be go far beyond what historically happened in AD 70, with the text transitioning seamlessly into something far more cataclysmic. And this would not be unprecedented for the Bible to abruptly change direction like this. Both Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 do something similar. Isaiah 14 starts out talking about the king of Babylon, but then starts to describe the fall of Lucifer from heaven. And so, I don't think the king of Babylon was in heaven, but it's a morphing. Ezekiel 28 does the same thing. I encourage you to read those two. Anyway, you read through Matthew 24 and you can come to your own conclusions. This is where our Wednesday study is picking up, so we will slow it down a little bit and go verse by verse here. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, now this is the clue that Jesus thought that the end was going to come soon, as did all of the rest of the New Testament writers. We'll get to why that would be in a minute. The tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give us light, the stars will fall from the sky, powers of the heavens will be shaken. All of this is fairly typical Jewish apocalyptic imagery that more than likely has a mix of figurative and literal language. Stars are often portrayed as political powers. So this could be, kind of metaphors for different things. Although the picture on our screen shows the darkening of the sun, the context of verse 29 seems to describe, or could describe, what is taking place in the heavenly realm. And then verse 30 and following takes place on earth. We just don't know. We have to, again, hold all of this loosely. Parallels with the sun being darkened at the time of Jesus' crucifixion also shouldn't be missed. Things happen in the heavens when the Son of Man is involved. And the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. He will send forth his angels with a great trumpet blast, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, one end of the sky from the other. People wonder, what is this sign? Could very well be that Jesus is the sign himself. The sign is simply Jesus. However, there are two Hebrew words that can map to the Greek word here used for sign. One Hebrew word is ot, which means letter, and that's also used of the signs of the 10 plagues. The other is nes, which, if you're familiar with the dreidel game at Hanukkah, can mean miracle. The four sides of the dreidel spell out nes gadol hayapo, means a great miracle happened there. But nes can also mean standard or flag or banner. And so with that in mind, Jesus could be referring to Isaiah 10, or perhaps it's both. I'm not going to read this whole thing for the sake of time, but in Isaiah 11, we see the nations, which you should read, always read Gentiles when you read nations in your Bible, come under the flag or banner of the Messiah, the root of Jesse. While at the same time, the Lord is recovering the remnant of his people. Those would be Jews, indicating that the spiritual blindness described by Paul in Romans 9, 10, 11 is in the process of being lifted or has been lifted. One thing that's interesting about this, you see that Jews and Gentiles are part of this day of the Lord, this messianic kingdom. A lot of people read Paul, they think he's being anti-Jewish when he's, kind of railing against Gentiles becoming Jewish. I don't see it that way. He is intent on Jews staying Jews and Gentiles staying as Gentiles, because he knew passages like this one, where the nations or Gentiles join with the Jews in the Messianic age. In other words, if all believing Gentiles were required to become Jews, then where there would be no more Gentiles. There has to be Gentiles in order for the sign of the Son of Man to be fulfilled. And that's kind of a tangent there, but I think keep that in mind when you're reading Paul, and it looks like he's talking strongly against Jewish. No, Paul remained a Jew to the end of his days. Read Acts 21. He kept the festivals. He desired to get to Jerusalem to maintain a festival. He was on trial for forsaking the Jewish law and tradition, and that's a charge that he vehemently denied. No, he was a full Jew and also a complete believer in Jesus. Similar to what we saw earlier, the vision of Jesus appearing will be unmistakable. It won't be a silent thing. Daniel 7, I kept looking at the night visions, and one like the Son of Man was coming on the clouds of heaven. Revelation 1, behold, he is coming with the clouds. So this imagery appears throughout the Bible, and it's very consistent. Both banners and trumpets were associated in Jewish eschatological thought, with the messianic arrival of the Messiah. So the fact that Jesus is referencing here, we're talking about the messianic kingdom. The trumpet blast, likely a reference to the shofar, comes from Isaiah 27 here. It will come about also on that day that a great trumpet will be blown, and those who are perishing in the land of Assyria will be scattered. In the land of Egypt will come to worship the Lord on the holy mountain in Jerusalem. It speaks of an ingathering, which lends support to viewing the sign of the Son of Man as back to what Isaiah was talking about. So the Son of Man coming on the clouds references an ingathering of. I too am wondering what all of this looks like. It just appears to be much bigger than my tiny brain can fathom. But no, again, that every eye will see him. This is not just a privileged few. You don't have to worry that you missed the second coming. If you're a believer in him, you will not. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. As soon as its branch has become tender and sprouts its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see that these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. In Hebrew, the word for summer is kayetz, and the word for end is ketz. And so there could be a little play here. The end is near, the summer is near. There's also a harvest metaphor, which has been repeatedly used to denote judgment at the end of the age. We looked at that in the parables in Matthew 13. One quote is, "So the weeds are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age." There's lots of loaded symbolism regarding the fig tree, and one of our videos that was several months back, but is actually just a couple videos back, is our fig tree video number 83. You can go back to that for some of the thoughts regarding the fig tree symbolism. Here, Jesus just seems to be saying that when you see these signs, you know the time is near. Like we might say, when you see the stores start to put up those Christmas decorations, you know Thanksgiving is just around the corner. This is a verse that has puzzled many commentators, and I think we need to take it in conjunction of verse 34 and verse 36. Verse 34 says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." And then in verse 36, he says, "About that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. And this language is also picked up in Mark's gospel. So these two seem contradictory, but what do you do when you think you found a contradiction? You celebrate, because if you dig, you'll be rewarded with a deeper understanding or a different way to look at it. This generation has perplexed scholars for centuries. The literal reading would certainly be this generation, meaning the generation he's speaking to. But if he knew that the end was going to happen within a generation, he would have to be wrong about verse 36. And to that we would say, God forbid. A day or an hour is an idiom for the general time frame. And so if he knew that it was going to happen within a generation, he would have to be lying when he said no one knows the day or the hour. So the day or the hour is not limited to literal year, month, day, hour, minute. It just means the general time frame. So he knew the general time frame of the destruction. He knew that was going to happen, but that calls into question at this time he was saying this. He didn't know when the end would be. I'm sure he knows now. Several explanations to reconcile verse 34 have been suggested. So we have this generation means, some would say Jesus was simply mistaken, and that's just terrible theology, and I would say God forbid. Some would say this generation is just the human race in general. These are the more of the amillennialists who would say, well, we're all called to be believers, and these things will happen during each of our lifetimes, and then we die, and then we get to be with him. That's really too general to be compelling. A lot of these are too general. Certainly the plain reading would be the generation alive at the time Jesus was giving these words, and that certainly makes sense. However, the Son of Man must be consistently applied across Matthew 24 and 25. And in no sense can the coming of described in Matthew 25 or the end here of 24 be accounted for by the destruction of Jerusalem. Again, if he was referring to a specific date, how could he later say no one knows the day? So to propose that he knew it would happen within a generation, but didn't know the specific year, that's just not a coherent argument, in my opinion. So again, you have to take verse 36, that no man knows the day or the hour with this generation. Could mean faithful Christians in general. It could mean Jews in general. Both of those are not really compelling. They're too general. It could mean some future evil generation like Genesis 6. That's a plausible view. Whenever that generation gets as evil as what we saw in Genesis 6, then these things will happen. Or he's saying just that generation that will be alive at the parousia, the second coming. Most conservative scholars would land on the last one, although each of the 7 arguments has holes you could poke in it. So if none of these options satisfy us, perhaps that is the point. Perhaps Jesus knew what he meant by this generation, and that's all we need to know. When it comes to the end times and our questions, always remember the Acts verse that I read at the beginning. When they had come together, they asked him, are you intending to restore Israel? And he says, it's not for you to know. Just you go be my witnesses. Our job is not to argue with each other about eschatology, the end times. Our job is to be his witnesses at home and around the globe and be a unified body of believers. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. They did not understand until the flood came, and they took them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man be. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. He may be saying the days will become as wicked as the days of Noah, but that is not required by the text. There's nothing inherently sinful about eating, drinking, or marrying unless you're doing those to excess. His point is at the time of the flood, most people were living life as normal, specifically a life without God, and they didn't heed any warning signs here. Why do you think John the Baptizer in Jesus' main instruction was what? It was to repent. Stop living your life as if you don't need God. That sense of urgency is still needed today. They didn't understand that the flood came and took them all away, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. At that time there will be 2 men in the field, one taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one taken, the other left. Luke actually adds a third pairing, about 2 people in bed, one taken and the other left, adding a nighttime element. So after referencing Noah and the flood, Jesus moves into this short parable about always being found ready. And there's a possible global reference here. Grinding is typically something one does in the morning. Working in the field could be done anytime during the daylight. And then if you add Luke's nighttime element, it happens at night. So this would be an event that happens instantaneously at the same instant, no matter where one is around the world. In the picture here, you see some types of grindstone. The one I'm familiar with is the one with the handle. You've got 2 millstones, one stationary, one fixed. You put the grain in between, and then you grind and grind and grind until it becomes flour. Another layer here is that the position of one's heart is the distinguishing factor, not their outward statuses. Then, and all three pairs, they were doing the same things, except one was different and one was, one was different than the other. Some might see this as the rapture, but I would not read that into this passage. The entire context is judgment. Remember, context is king. In Noah's flood and in many of Jesus' parables, it's not the good who were taken out and the bad left behind. It's exactly the opposite. The bad perished, were taken out and perished in Noah's flood. The bad will perish in judgment at the end of the age. In the parables, it's the weeds who are removed and burned. We see examples of this throughout. Matthew 25 is actually going to unpack all of this in much more detail when we get to the famous parables of those not ready and the sheep and the goat. The comparison to Noah's flood and the earlier reference to vultures, I would say, indicate that the entire context has a sinister tone in his judgment and is not something positive. Therefore, be on the alert. You do not know which day your Lord is coming. The point is that believers need to be vigilant for Jesus' return, which will be sudden and unexpected. And there's a time where I prefer the eloquence of the King James. Mark 13:35 says, "Watch ye therefore, for ye know not when the master of the house cometh." And sometimes you just can't beat the old King James. We're not to fear the coming days or sit on our hands waiting to be rescued out of tough times. Remember the story I like to tell of the watchman on the wall, Ezekiel 33. If a watchman sees danger and warns people, but the people ignore, then the watchman has done his job and will be held blameless. If the watchman sees danger coming but doesn't say anything and the people are attacked, the watchman has their blood on his hands. You and I are to be the watchmen for our neighbors. Remember also, in closing here, the blessing for loving his appearing that we see in 2 Timothy. In the future, there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, not only to me, but all who have loved his appearing. So keep that in mind. We're not to fear. We're to be on mission. Acts 1:8, be his hands and feet, be his emissaries, his ambassadors, and just share with others and warn them about what is coming and the newness of life that can be found. Don't just focus on the negative, focus on the good stuff, the newness of life that can be found in Jesus. My sense here is that the chapter break should have occurred either just before or just after verse 42. That brings the Q&A time to a conclusion. And verses 43 and following, and then all of 25, begin these parable-like teachings of the final judgment, which will dovetail into what officially is our chapter 25, and the familiar parables of the 10 virgins, the talents, and the sheep and goat judgments. We'll get into all of that next time along the Talmudim way.